In the name of Jesus, my dear friends, John Maxwell, in his book Failing Forward, quotes Kyle Rote Jr., who once said, "The only time you really fail is when you fail to look beyond your failure." Think about that for a moment. We'd all love to be consistent in our faith walk with Jesus, wouldn't we? We'd love to be able to walk with the confidence of St. Paul's faith when he wrote to the Philippians in chapter 4, "I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength." But here's our reality. Each and every one of us, without exception, will most certainly fail at different times in our lives. We'll fail ourselves, we'll fail our family and friends and those that we love the most, and we most certainly will fail God, at least in the expectations we believe that he has of us. And when those times happen, we're tempted to quit before we try to get back up, because we're often paralyzed by our fears and convinced that if we try again, we're only going to make a bigger mess of things. And when those times happen, friends, we must run to Jesus, whose mercies are always new, whose love for us never fades, and whose grace for us never fails. But at times, let's be honest, our fear of failure is at sometimes a measure of self-preservation that keeps us from doing foolish and dangerous things and thus avoiding the harm that we might thus experience. But more often than not, our fear of failure is simply the self-imposed prison we put ourselves in, afraid of failing even more. But the only thing that results from that is that we keep ourselves from all that God would give to us, all that God would do in us, and all that God would do through us into the lives of other people. I want you to think about one of the apostles. His real name is Simon, but we know him as Peter. When Jesus first called Peter as one of his disciples, said, "Come and leave your fishing, and I'll make you a fisher of men." And it was at that event, at least one of the gospel writers tell us, that Jesus already says to Peter, back then at the beginning, before anything's really happened, "Peter, you will be named the Rock, Peter." Remember what we do know about Peter's life. When Jesus once asked to his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter's the one that jumps up. "Ooh, ooh, ooh, ooh. You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus praises Peter for his confession. And he says, upon your confession of faith, upon that rock, I'm going to build the church. He's becoming the rock. Except just moments later, Jesus says how he must suffer and die according to the scriptures. And Peter says, "No way, you're not doing that, Jesus." And Jesus has to say to Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan, for you don't have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Peter, too, is the only one that gets to walk on water with Jesus, remember? And he's doing it until he gives in to his fearful doubts about the wind and the waves, and he begins to sink, and Jesus has to rescue him and pull him back up on top of the water again. In the upper room on Monday, Thursday evening, Jesus says, in order for the scriptures to be fulfilled, all of you will be scattered, just as the scriptures say. And Peter says, "No, not me. Even if everybody else deserts you, I love you too much. I am never, even if I have to go to prison or die with you, I'm not going to do that." Probably one of the reasons that Peter takes that sword with him into Gethsemane. But Jesus says to Peter, "Peter, Satan has demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But Peter, I've prayed for you so that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Be the rock," in other words. Peter says, "I'm not leaving your side, Jesus." Jesus says, "Peter, tonight, before the rooster crows in the morning, you'll deny me 3 times that you ever knew me." And even as his third denial is happening, even as the rooster is crowing, Luke's gospel tells us that Jesus stops in the midst of his trial and looks out the window and makes eye contact with Peter. Why? Peter, remember, I love you. Peter, there's grace and forgiveness for you. Peter, you're the rock. Even this failure is not going to undo your calling. Peter's failure does not end Jesus' plan for Peter's life. And what Jesus is saying in those moments, I think, ultimately is, Peter, even in the midst of your failure, keep your eyes on me, not on how you're failing. And while you and I, we know Peter's failure doesn't thwart Jesus' plan for Peter's life, because we know the rest of the story in the Gospels and the book of Acts and in Peter's 2 letters. But we all do understand where he's at. That we all do things that we thought that we knew we never wanted to do and that we didn't believe we were capable of doing. And we fail the ones that we love the most. We find ourselves deeply disappointed in ourselves. We usually beat ourselves up, bad boy, bad boy. And we're tempted to wallow in our guilt and resign ourselves to the false belief that we're disqualified, that we're not good enough, that we're nothing better, more than a failure, and never going to ever again be acceptable to God or useful to God in any capacity. We're not even worthy to be called a disciple anymore. We may believe such things about ourselves, and Peter, honestly, he certainly struggled with such things after denying Jesus that night. But understand, this is not how Jesus felt about Peter that night or any other day. Again, remember, early on Easter morning, when Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb and she's the first to see the resurrected Jesus, what's the message that Jesus gives Mary to say? Go tell the disciples and Peter that I'm going ahead of them and we'll see them in Galilee. Recall how, as we learned last week, the Emmaus disciples, when Jesus met them along the road and they finally recognized him when they sat down to eat a meal that evening, when they're back, they rush back to Jerusalem and tell the other disciples how they've seen Jesus and that he was alive. They mentioned that Peter has also seen Jesus that afternoon, Easter afternoon at some point. St. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15, verifies the fact that Jesus appeared to Peter sometime that day. Act of grace. Peter's there. Peter's there when Jesus appears in the locked house with all the other disciples and Thomas is missing. Peter is there 8 days later when Thomas is back again and he sees all of that. We know, and because we have the scriptures and its testimony, and Jesus knew, even at that point, even though Peter is not there yet, Peter is the rock. He's the rock, going to be the rock for the early church after Jesus ascends. He's going to be the preacher on Pentecost, where thousands of people are going to come to faith, repent, and be baptized and be saved. But Jesus will restore him, even though Peter still feels disqualified. Let's learn from Peter's struggles. Again, we will all of us, certainly fail at things in life. And even despite our best efforts, when we look back at what happened in our past, instead of rehearsing how you and I have failed God, failed ourselves, failed the people that we've loved, instead of rehearsing our failure, let's look back and rehearse what Jesus has done for us and how Jesus has called us and how Jesus is with us and how Jesus is for us. And we stand in his mercy and grace and his goodness. In our text, we're told this morning in John 21, it's very early in the morning. Peter had invited early the evening before the disciples, and there are, I think, at least 6 other disciples with him, to go out fishing. Actually, he says, I'm going fishing. They all said, well, can we come too? And they've been out all night, and it's early, early, early morning. And they're coming in having not caught a single fish all night. They're about 100 yards offshore. And there's a man standing on the shore, and he calls out to them. They don't recognize and realize that it's Jesus. And he says, "Friends, have you have no fish?" And they say, "No, we don't." Jesus said, "Then we'll throw your net down on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." And when they threw their net down on the right side, there were so many fish in their nets, they couldn't haul it back into the boat. They literally had to drag their nets full of fish to the shore. What's Jesus doing? Because obviously this should sound very familiar to us, because this is exactly in virtually every detail exactly what happened when Jesus first called Peter to follow him, then even make him a fisher of men. Why is Jesus doing that? He's taking them back in their past to remember those moments of where Jesus has interacted in their lives and how Jesus called them, how Jesus invited them in grace to follow him, and all that Jesus has done for him in between. Yeah, some scholars and commentators write, well, Jesus was showing that he could provide for them, and certainly he could. I think there's something even greater going on. Jesus is trying to get them to experience again their past in the positive way of Jesus becoming involved in their lives and making them his disciples and all that has happened as a result. I think that's especially true for Peter. Peter, remember that day. Peter, remember I told you you would become the rock. Peter, remember how I invited you with grace to come and follow me and leave your nets behind? Peter, remember I said I'll make you fishers of men. That has not changed. Your failure has not changed that. I still love you. I still want you. And I'm still calling you to follow me. Friends, rehearse what Jesus has done in your life. Because rehearsing your failures and your fears because of them only immobilize you and never gets you past anything. Well, the disciples soon realize in that miraculous catch of fish, again, reliving the days of Jesus first calling them into ministry and inviting them to be his disciples. But John is the first one to pick out and say, that's Jesus on shore. And so he turns to Peter and he says, it's the Lord. And as soon as Peter heard John say, it's the Lord, Peter puts on his outer robe. Remember, they had the under robe. He had taken that off while they were working all night. It's hot, sweaty, hard work. And now he puts on his public robe. And he jumps into the water. He's racing now towards Jesus. Why is he jumping in the water? Because he wants to leave his old life behind, the life of sin and failure. He's eager because he loves Jesus, to be with Jesus and join Jesus. He may not feel like he's qualified to be the leader of the disciples. He may not believe that there's grace to cover his failures, but he loves Jesus still. And if there's anything Jesus wants him to do, or if he can be around Jesus, that's what Peter wants. And so he jumps into the water, leaving the old life behind. And he is determined, I think, even though he sees himself as a loser, as no good, as disqualified, he's doing anything and everything he feels he's able to do to help Jesus move his ministry forward. Friends, that's our reason to drop our own wallowing in our own guilt and failure too. Because God in his grace gives us the opportunity to come and join Jesus once again. Each and every day, as often as it takes. His mercies are new every day, even for us. Don't look back except to remember how Jesus met you there in your past. And how God's grace and mercy covered you, and his forgiveness set you free. Well, the disciples get to the shore. And here's the second miracle. He doesn't really need the fish that he helped them to catch. He's already got a fire going with bread and baked and fish hot over the open fire. But notice what Jesus says. Bring me some of the fish you've just caught. It's a baby step. It's a small step, but Jesus is inviting Peter into an opportunity to join him in what he's doing. If Jesus says, I want this, then Peter can go do it. It's something he's ready to do. It's a small and it's a simple thing. But don't miss the invitation to be under God's grace. And Peter seizes the opportunity. He literally hauls the whole net with all those fish to shore all by himself. They all sit down together to eat with Jesus. And when they're finished eating, Jesus would extend his gracious restoration to Peter and make Peter's healing complete. And so when they were done eating, Jesus turned to Peter and said, Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Reflecting back on what Peter had said in the upper room. Remember, even if they all run away, I won't. Jesus is using the Greek word for love that means sacrificial love, unconditional love, no matter what it takes to sacrifice on behalf of the other. Simon, son of John, do you truly sacrificially love me? And Peter responds, Lord, I brotherly love you. Is that relationship still real? But notice Jesus says, feed my lambs. He's asked the second time. He drops the more than these. He simply says, Simon, son of John, do you sacrificially love me? Jesus and Peter says a second time, Lord, you know I love you. You're my brother. We're in relationship. And Jesus asked Peter a third time, but he now brings himself down to Simon's level. And he says, Simon, son of John, no longer do you agape sacrificially love me. Do you phileo brotherly love me? And Peter's hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know I love you. And so Jesus said for the third time, feed my sheep. Why does Jesus do that? Because he wants to apply the gospel of his grace specifically to each of these 3 points of failure that Peter believes has disqualified him. And hear what he does, even though it's painful to hear on Peter's side. Hear the invitation of Jesus, even the command of Jesus, feed my sheep, take care of my sheep, feed my lambs. Even at even at the point of his greatest personal defeat and failure. Still, Peter, feed my sheep. Follow me. Be the rock that I've called you to be. Live out the purpose that I've given to you in your life. Feed my sheep. Peter, by grace you're loved. Peter, by grace you're forgiven. Peter, I accomplished all on the cross, which means you're forgiven even of these things. Peter, do you love me? Yes, I do, Jesus. Then feed my sheep. Let's get on with the business. We all live and walk by grace. Notice that this is the point. This is the very point where Peter's life is totally transformed. There's no going back. There's no looking back. The kind of person Peter becomes is now better than it was before. Why? Because Peter has allowed the gospel of God's grace to be personally applied to his life. It's one thing to try to be that for other people, but it's another thing to receive it and internalize it, that the God who sent his one only son, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross, suffer and die on the cross and rise again from the dead, did it for me, and that what he did there counts for me and covers me and empowers me. That changes everything. And what's even more amazing is that when you think back and ask, well, why did Peter deny Jesus that night that Jesus was betrayed? Isn't it really because he was afraid of being tortured or killed himself? Quite a natural thing. It was a dangerous night. But I want you to notice something here that might seem at first blush a little bit odd to us in the text. Because Jesus tells Peter how he's going to die. But here's why. Again, Peter failed because he was afraid to die. And Jesus tells him, Peter, even when you die, it will glorify me. You aren't going to fail again. You're going to be faithful to me to the very last till I call you home to heaven. Friends, don't miss what we learned from Peter, the rock. Allow the gospel of God's grace to be applied personally to your lives, especially when we fail. Hear God's call of grace, even to you and me. Follow me. Learn to give up rehearsing your past failures and instead only look back in the past to see what Jesus has done for you and how he's been with you and for you and helping you. And know that he has a plan and a purpose for your life too. And just as you and I, even today, benefit from what Jesus did for Peter back in those days in John 21, so others will benefit from the witness and testimony that we give to Jesus in our life, in the way that God has called us to the people that God puts around us, so that we can be our own living expression of the gospel to the world. Don't let your failure rule, for you're no longer in failure. You abide in God's grace through Christ.